Again, I invite you to open back up to John 18. John chapter 18, and we are in the middle of the passion of Jesus Christ. Jesus has been betrayed by Judas. He has been captured in the Garden of Gethsemane. He has been taken to the house of Annas and Caiaphas. He's already had his trial with Annas. John here briefly mentions he had a trial with Caiaphas, and then much of the passage that we read today is the trial with Pilate. Now, many of us can think back to a time when we were a child. There's some of you that might not have had this experience. This is an experience that I've definitely had. And there was something that I really wanted. Maybe it's something you could think of when you were a child that you really wanted it. So, like any child, you went to your mom or your dad or your grandma, or whoever it was that was in charge of you at the time. And usually, if you had a choice, you tried to pick the family member that you knew was the easiest to manipulate, right? The one that you could easily get a yes out of. So you go up to them and say, "Can I have this? Can I have this new bike? Or can I have this new toy?" And sometimes they might say yes. Sometimes they would say no, and might say other things. But then there were those dreaded times when they would say, "Oh, go ask your dad." Or go ask your mom, or go ask your uncle, or whomever. Go ask this person or that person. And so you go to that other person, and what would they say? "Oh, you got to go ask your mom. Oh, you got to go ask your..." "I just asked them, and they told me to ask you." And you feel like you're being bounced around, and you know that, looking back on it, your parents didn't want you to have whatever it was, but they felt bad for you, and they just might have felt a little lazy making the call, and so they wanted the other parent maybe to make the call, or they had other reasons for why they did what they did, but they just tossed you around like a pinball, back and forth between the parents there. Maybe you eventually got what you wanted. I had a friend growing up, and I remember him saying this. Man, I don't know how young I was, but there are certain things you just always remember. And I remember him saying, "Oh, well, you just have to pester them long enough." And I'm thinking, doesn't work with my parents. And evidently, though, he was able to work the system and get what he wanted sometimes. But there are times when you just feel like, man, no matter how hard I try, I can't get to where I want to go or get what I want. And as we look at this passage today, we're beginning to see how difficult it was for the Jews to actually put Jesus to death. We can many times just think of the story from the standpoint of, wow, they got Jesus and they ran him through the ringer and they crucified him and on and so forth. But there were a lot of steps that the Jews had to go through to get what they wanted, and in a sense for Satan to get what he wanted as well. So even though the Jews were there and they took custody of Jesus, they first took him to Annas, the high priest, the high priest's father, who was a previous high priest, and they had a time of questioning, and Jesus was physically beaten, probably across the face. And then he was bounced to Caiaphas, who was the high priest of the day, and we see that mentioned in verse 28. And then he would be bounced around some more, until eventually the Jews got the green light to put Jesus to death. So although John doesn't record them all, the witnesses of the four Gospels, they record that Jesus actually suffered six different unjust trials. And if you look at John, there's only 3 mentioned. Now, if you just take the book of Luke, that kind of supplements and you can get the full 6. So, again, Jesus first was taken to Annas, then he was taken to Caiaphas, and then he was taken to the Sanhedrin, which was the council, which I think met in Caiaphas' house. Then he was taken to Pilate. Then Pilate sent him over to Herod, and Herod sent him back to Pilate. And then then they proceeded to take Jesus to the cross. So Jesus actually suffered through 6 unjust trials. So he was like a pinball being bounced back and forth. So far, our journey through the book of John has taken us through basically 1 to 2 of these trials. And at this passage today, we're going to look at some of the trial proceedings from Pilate. Now, as we've seen in these last few messages, if you've been here, the past few times I've preached through John, you've seen that the overarching theme of this time in Jesus' life and this part of the book is a theme of injustice. There are other themes, of course, the passion of Christ and suffering, but a big theme here is the theme of injustice. Just about everything about this story has to do with some form or another of injustice that Jesus suffered for us. Again, Jesus did absolutely nothing, even less than nothing wrong, right? He was perfect to deserve any of this treatment. We can all think of times when we were treated unjustly. We were accused of something we did not do, but yet we still suffered for it. And we think of how angry we were at that time. Well, Jesus suffered that times infinity as we look at this part of the story of Jesus' life. And it's ironic that the most perfect person in the universe suffered the most injustice in the universe. And I'd say this truth should drive us to love and to appreciate Jesus so much more. And it should motivate us to be willing to suffer injustice if he calls us to. But as we all know, we struggle greatly in these areas of loving Jesus and being willing to suffer injustice if he calls us to, whether it's because we're a Christian or maybe it doesn't matter that we're a Christian. We all can suffer injustice for a variety of reasons, and no matter the reason, and for different reasons and different scenarios, there might be different legitimate ways to respond, right? But God calls us to respond in a way that is pleasing to him. So we struggle, though, right? We struggle to delight in the gospel day by day. And we push back whenever God has called us to suffer injustice. We naturally push back against that because injustice is hard. Injustice is painful. And whenever we suffer from it, though, hopefully it can remind us of the horrible injustice that we read about in these pages of Scripture, that Jesus suffered for us. And so as we look at this passage today, let me encourage you to allow the Holy Spirit to take his word, to renew your minds and hearts, and to take control of our hearts in these areas as well. And as we move through the passage now, I'd like to say I believe the first part of the passage that we looked at today is teaching that we must surrender to God's will because Jesus suffered religious hypocrisy for us. We must surrender to God's will. Why? Because Jesus suffered injustice for us. Injustice in the form of religious hypocrisy. We'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. But religious hypocrisy, and that you have people who claim to be spiritual. They've got all the trappings of being a religious, godly person, but yet they are a wolf in sheep's clothing. So if you can take a look at your passage again with me, we're going to look at verses 28 through 32 at this time. And at this time of the story, we see that they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. And the governor again was Pilate, the Roman governor. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So, once Jesus experienced his second unjust trial, as John tells the story, this was after he suffered his third. In reality, when you look at the other Gospels, again, Annas to Caiaphas to the council, the Sanhedrin. After that, he was led away to Pilate's headquarters. Now, Pilate was the Roman governor in the area. He was not a Jew. It seems he did not like the Jews. He did not like being there. He was a slippery person. He was a weak leader, it seems. And there's some that you can read about as far as the secular history about Pilate, which I'm not going to get into this morning for sake of time. But anyway, he was the person there who had the authority to condemn someone to death. Now, John notes that it was early morning. There's a good chance this is around 6 a.m., so it could have been that, I naturally like to think that maybe it was earlier than that, but it could be that the Romans got their day started earlier. I think there's some historical accounts to support that. And so this might have been Pilate's first job in the morning, was to see Jesus and to talk with these Jews about Jesus. So at this point, John dips back. If you've been through any of this series over these few years that I've been in the book of John, John dips back into irony. The irony that he uses so well in his gospel, where he states one thing, but it has a deeper meaning, or has a double meaning, so to speak. And if you look here at verse 28, after it says it was early morning, speaking of the Jews, he says, they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now, I'd like you to think a moment about why that is so ironic. And I think there's actually 2 points of irony, of double meaning, so to speak, that we can see in this part of the verse. So he states, first of all, the Jews refused to go into Pilate's headquarters so that they would not be ceremonially defiled and they could not eat of the Passover. But they are fine defiling themselves spiritually by treating Jesus with this height of injustice. They are fine trying to condemn a righteous and innocent man, but they're doing it in such a way so they can still be religious. The height of hypocrisy. It just makes you wonder whether on any level they're aware of how hypocritical they're being at this point. How they care so much about being able to partake of their religious feast that they are fine killing someone, but doing it in a way so they can still partake of their religious feast. But as I said, it's ironic on 2 levels, and I believe the second irony is even greater. And that is, what is the feast that they actually wanted to participate in? And what were they doing in that moment? In other words, they go to the trouble to keep themselves ceremonially clean to celebrate the very feast that points to what they are trying to do to Jesus in that moment. They are trying to sacrifice the Lamb of God and do the very thing that this Passover points to. So, in a way, they are celebrating the Passover unwittingly, and they are celebrating the Passover twice in a way that they absolutely would never have wanted to do if they had understood what they were really doing. So they celebrated the Passover by bringing to pass the thing they hated most, the ultimate victory of Jesus Christ. It just boggles my mind when I think about it and how blind these religious leaders were. And that's what bitterness does to people, right? That's what hatred does to people. You're blind. You cannot see the truth. And you do things that will only hurt you, will only hurt others, and hopefully one day you'll realize what you did and you can repent of it and seek restoration. But that is what was going on with these religious leaders. They were blinded by their jealousy, they were blinded by their rage, their anger, and their hatred of Jesus, and they, in that, played right into the Father's hands, in that they did his exact will, even though that was the last thing they wanted to do. And I believe that this should give us great comfort whenever we're suffering injustice, because if God used this injustice to work his perfect plan, any injustice that I might face or that you might face, we can be confident is doing the same thing. Now, we have the benefit of looking at this story and seeing exactly how this injustice worked out God's plan. But when you suffer injustice, when I suffer injustice, we many times do not have that luxury. I would say probably most of the time we do not have that luxury. We're just sitting there suffering, like Job, on some level, and we have no idea what's going on, but we feel miserable. But when we look at passages like this, we can see that God is doing something amazing, and we have to trust him through it. He is doing something amazing to accomplish his wonderful plan. So, we see here, thank you, Byron. We see here that once the Jews and Jesus arrive at Pilate's headquarters, Pilate goes outside to meet them, all right? Pilate might have been used to this, right? He's like, oh, here they come again. They're not going to come in here to see me. I have to go out to see them. So they're already inconveniencing Pilate. Pilate already is not in a good mood, right? But a key thing about Pilate, I think we should all understand it, is that he has enormous tension in his job, right? He, at one point, doesn't want to give the Jews any satisfaction at all. But in the other point, he doesn't want to lose his job and make his superiors upset with him. So he has to walk this tightrope, so to speak, of his own emotions. And so he realizes that in this situation, he doesn't hold the cards, right? He's got to go out and he's got to talk to these Jews because that's the job that he's been given. And so if we see here at verse 29, it says, so Pilate went outside to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? So someone would have already briefed Pilate and said, all right, you've got some Jews outside with someone, and they say he's a really, really bad person. So Pilate walks out and says, all right, what's wrong with him? What did he do? Verse 30, the Jews answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Now imagine that you're Pilate. You don't want to talk to these people. You don't even want to be outside right now. And yet here they are standing before you, and they are almost mocking you. You ask them a legitimate question, a question that is entirely in line with your job. And all they do is throw it back in your face and say, Pilate, do you think we would bring you someone that hadn't done anything wrong? And Pilate's probably thinking, yeah, maybe you would actually. But anyway, Pilate has to play the game. He has to go along with this. But he kind of throws it back at them, doesn't he? If you look at verse 31, Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. So Pilate understood exactly what they meant, I think. When they answered him and said, don't you think we wouldn't have brought him unless he had done something really bad? Pilate's thinking, all right, so they didn't accuse him of anything. I'm sure in the past they've been very vocal about accusing people before Pilate, and this time they have nothing to say. So I'm wondering if it seems like Pilate's calling their bluff here in the next verse. He says to them, well, you take him. You judge him by your own law. So kind of trying to push the discomfort back on the Jews. And the Jews said to him, but Pilate, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. That's your job. And at this point in the passage, John pauses to give a helpful point of explanation. Verse 32. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Now, if you're like me, you're reading this verse thinking, when did Jesus talk about the kind of death he was going to die? Obviously in other passages, he told his disciples, take up your cross and follow me. But I think the clearest passage in the book of John may be back in John chapter 3 when he's talking to Nicodemus. If you think back to that passage, John chapter 3 verses 14 and 15, it says, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And we all know John 3:16 that follows that. And here Jesus speaks about him being lifted up. And speaking of his death here, and I think this might be the passage that John is pointing back to. There could be a different one, but here I think this could be the one that John is saying this was to fulfill what Jesus had spoken by what kind of death he was going to die. In other words, the Jews couldn't crucify anyone. The Jews couldn't kill anyone, period, but it was the Romans who could kill you, and it was crucifixion that would have been probably the common way for them to execute someone. So here, John is saying, God's in complete control. This was all part of the plan. It looks really bad, but God has worked everything out. So we see here this very important passage here, just explaining to us what was going on about Jesus' upcoming death. So here we have Jesus, seemingly powerless in the hands of the Jews, suffering the worst injustice ever experienced in the universe. He was just hours away from suffering the worst death ever to be experienced in the universe. Yet Jesus did not fight back. He did not struggle. He did not deny his Father. He did not complain. But he resolutely went forward to glorify his Father and to provide for our salvation. And so in this part of the passage, we see, I think, several things that the Lord wants to teach us. First of all, I just want to say there are many types of injustice that we can face in life. I think we all can be aware of that, right? And we could probably tick through some of the times that we've suffered injustice. But one of the most painful and disgusting is injustice perpetrated by those who claim to be religious or spiritual. That's, I would say, probably the most disgusting and infuriating. My mind, of course, goes to all the horrible instances that we have heard about even throughout history of wicked hypocrites using their position in the church to prey on people, to prey on children, to prey on other vulnerable people who are easily susceptible to that injustice and to their abuse. Now, of course, we can talk about the Roman Catholic Church. That's been in the news many times over the years. But I think we also need to talk about evangelical churches where injustice has occurred, abuse has occurred. And we also need to talk about even conservative Christian churches like Hope Baptist Church. Churches that we might call sister churches where sinful and unjust activity has occurred. There's no room for that in the house of God. There is no room at all. And if we as a church, and other churches as well, that allow that to happen, are rightly guilty of that injustice as well. Even if they did not take part in it, but they allowed it to happen and they turned a blind eye. Now, this isn't the only form of injustice that can be perpetrated by religious hypocrites, where children are abused and so on and so forth. But I would just say that we at Hope Baptist Church, on a very practical level, always need to be super vigilant. I'm just going to say there was a point during Vacation Bible School where I was just like, I'm just going to keep my eyes open here, because I don't think anything's ever going to happen, but we don't want to ever open ourselves up to any accusation that anything like that could ever happen here. And we should all be vigilant like that. We should all be extra careful that we are never compromising ourselves or putting ourselves in a position where someone could accuse us of doing something horribly wrong and unjust. So we could point to plenty of examples of injustice, and one of them that we see as well in modern churches is not necessarily something like sexual abuse, but how the preacher of the church, the pastor of the church, manipulates the hearers with their teaching about giving and tithing and promising health and wealth if you just simply give, right? And it's ironic to me that preachers who have no problem downplaying the gospel, not really preaching the cross of Christ, but they'll take those passages on giving. They will do an expository sermon, so to speak, on every single passage imaginable on giving in the Bible, and they will preach those to the nth degree. I'm thinking, why don't you take your same interpretive philosophy and apply that to the gospel, right? Maybe your church would be different, right? Maybe your church would be more godly if you did that, but no, churches like that are all about hypocrisy and injustice in that way. Now, I want to be very clear. Tithing is in the Bible. Giving is in the Bible. We at Hope Baptist Church do not often, at least whenever I'm here, we do not often preach on giving. But maybe we should preach on giving a little more, because it's something that's important to God, and it shows how much we love Him when we sacrificially give towards Him. So I'm definitely not anti-preaching on that, but what I'm saying is there is a big form of injustice where churches become all about the money. And that's wrong. And it's sinful. It's ungodly. It's unbiblical. So that's another type of hypocrisy that we see. But there are many other examples we could point out as well. But I think it's important to see how Jesus' meekness and obedience, as He suffered through this, how that should affect our response to injustice. Now, sure, the injustice that Jesus faced was different than any injustice we will ever face, right? He's the Son of God. We are not. He was dying for the sin of the world. We never will, right? So right there at the outset, very different. But at the same level, injustice is still injustice, right? And there are some things that we can see from Jesus' response through this whole time that we should take away and that we should emulate in our own response when we suffer injustice. And it doesn't mean that we should take necessarily injustice lying down. It's like, oh, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. I should just let it happen. No, if there are legitimate ways that we should call that out and respond to it, absolutely. But there's one thing or some things that we should not do. We should not give in to bitterness. We should not lash out in sinful anger. But we can seek justice against wrongdoers in the right way. And we can also seek righteous vindication for ourselves, but especially, I would say, so that others are not affected by that injustice that we may have suffered. It means, though, that we should ultimately trust God, that we should be reminded of the injustice that Christ suffered for us, and that we should respond with gratitude for the injustice that Christ faced for us. So it's kind of like, whenever you are somewhere and you might smell a certain smell or, see a certain something, and that smell or that image takes you back 20 years. And it takes you back to a memory that you had never thought about. And there's a certain smell, whenever I smell it, I think back to my grandparents' house when I was there, 30 years ago or something. And I think the same thing should be true when we suffer injustice. Whenever we suffer injustice, we should automatically, almost reflex, think to Christ suffering injustice for us. And then react, in a sense, with gratitude, thinking, wow, I'm suffering injustice, but this is nothing compared to what Jesus suffered for me. And then we have a time of worship, even though we are suffering under that injustice. We should respond with faith that God is using the injustice for His perfect plan. We must surrender to God's will. Surrender is not comfortable. No one likes to surrender in any way, shape, or form. Surrender is not in agreement with our flesh, right? But nevertheless, we must surrender to God's will because Jesus suffered religious hypocrisy for us. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not going to be able to make it through the whole passage, but I am going to go ahead and jump ahead. Next time I have the privilege of preaching the Sunday morning service, Lord willing, we'll look at this next part of the passage, where we'll see that we must surrender to God's will because Jesus suffered governmental corruption for us. He suffered injustice at the government, with the government. That's something that many people, even in our modern age, are very familiar with. And we'll see how Jesus responded to that. But I'd like, lastly, us to see what I would call the main idea of this passage, that we must surrender to God's will because Jesus surrendered to injustice for us. We must surrender to God's will, whatever it is. And that can include suffering injustice, right? We must surrender to God's will because Jesus surrendered to injustice for us. So, as we bring our time this morning to a close, how is God calling you and calling me to surrender to Jesus in the face of injustice? It could be perceived injustice. It might not have been unjust at all, but we thought it was. And we're having a hard time with that. It could be injustice that we have faced in the past. Could have been decades ago, but yet it's still fresh in our minds. It could be injustice that you are facing now. You might now be going through something that's very trying. It could be injustice that you haven't faced yet, but you will face. And as Chaplain Finley earlier spoke about spiritual fitness, I'm going to take a leap that I might know what he's talking about. We should be spiritually fit. We should be spiritually in shape to be able to handle that injustice when it comes across our path. No matter the timing or the type of injustice, again, there are many types, many kinds, and some of you can say, well, I've suffered this and this and this, and you can go on down a laundry list of the times that you have wrongly suffered. But no matter the type, no matter the time, no matter how long it takes, God calls us to respond in faith and to surrender to his plan. We must surrender to God's will because Jesus surrendered to injustice for us.